recording is now on, just so everyone is aware. So I think we'll start now, and then if anybody comes in, I will let them in as we go. So again, thank you everybody for coming. This is our second widescreen session now. For everyone that doesn't know, widescreen is a project that we are running here at the Dukes Theatre. Well, not here, but at the Dukes Theatre. And it is a project led by me, Keela Chambers-Turner. And it is for us to help make our programming and content more diverse and inclusive, and for us to just learn about why that's important. So the session we're doing today, we're going to be focusing, or at least referencing, the movie Sound of Metal. It stars Riz Ahmed, who is a British Pakistani who plays a heavy metal drummer. He has a strong passion for music, and then he suddenly starts to lose his hearing. And the movie is about how, when he has that part of his life threatened, how he takes it, how he goes on his road to recovery, and sort of that process and that journey. As far as diverse films go, we think it's really good in the sense of it has a person of color as its main character, but doesn't focus on that. That isn't like the main plot point, which is something that we find really important, because a lot of the time that sort of is the only reason people tend to be in those roles. And it's also good because it gives that deaf community a voice. It gives them this story to sort of represent how things happen and sort of the feelings and emotions that people might not normally hear or understand. And so that's really important, I think. So moving on from that, I would like my guests to introduce themselves. Mariam, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for Keela to having us here. My name is Mariam Gorban-Karimi, and I'm a lecturer in film practice at Lancaster University, and my research is focusing on representation of women in Middle Eastern cinema. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jaffa?
Evening, everyone. My name is Jaff. I am the chair of the Institute for Youth Work, which is a national body representing youth workers up and down the country. And I also work for Lancashire BME Network as the Young People's Programmes Manager.
Yeah. So very cool guests we have today. So the way our session is going to work is our two lovely guests are going to show us some presentations they have come up with. And we're just going to listen and talk about sort of why that's all important, and then we'll have a short Q&A at the end. So if anybody has any questions along the way, feel free to pop them in the chat box or let us know at the end, and we'll talk through them. Okay, so Mariam, would you like to go?
Sure. So let's do this. Do you see my slides? Yeah. So in spirit of keeping time, I've tried to kind of put together, written my notes, so I'm trying to kind of follow it through. So today in my presentation, I want to look at the issue of inclusivity and representation in films, and briefly address some of the achievements and challenges while pointing out that there is still a long way to go to achieve inclusivity and diversity in film. It is important to understand that this is an issue ingrained in the film industry from early days of its inception. And as you can see here, I've put two kind of very famous films from the golden Hollywood era from 1920s. Like The Thief of Baghdad is depicting Douglas Fairbanks presenting a Middle Eastern character, a very loose adaptation of one of the stories from 1001 Nights, The Thief of Baghdad. And the film is quite kind of an Orientalist look at the Middle East. And then on the other side, you have the jazz singer that has that problematic kind of the face painting, painted character during one of his performances. And it is the jazz singers, the first talkie you've ever of cinema in the 1927. So I also need to point out that I'm looking at the mainstream film and TV due to their wider reach to the public. So I'm not undermining the hard work of artists and filmmakers that have been striving to achieve this for a much longer time. So I'm just looking at the mainstream from to see what kind of achievements they have made and what it still needs to be done. So, and when I say industry at this stage, I'm just talking about casting and the subject matter of the films and not other aspects and areas of creative process. Because there's no time. And as my case study, I'm going to look at the representation of Muslims in film as the star of the film, Sound of Metal, as Kilo mentioned as well, Riz Ahmed, that we're focusing on, identifies as a Muslim and has been very outspoken about the misrepresentation of Muslims in film. It is worth noting that although as the casting of people of color in films does automatically help diversify the industry, there are some issues that need to be addressed because, of course, like the typecasting or tokenism to tick certain boxes. However, blind casting, whether colorblind or gender blind casting, can address some of these issues that in itself has raised some eyebrows as well, that we can talk about it if you're interested afterwards. Many might think that the stereotypical representation of Muslim or Middle Eastern looking characters might have begun since 9/11. Like these two popular TV series. For example, on 24, you have the protagonist directly fighting terrorism stemming from somewhere in the Muslim world. And in Lost, the only heavily featured Middle Eastern character, Syed, played by the wonderful Naveen Andrews, was contextualized as an Iraqi soldier who has tortured people. Of course, these othering of people from certain Muslim backgrounds has not started in 2001. It has been present in Hollywood since its inception. And if you're interested to learn more about this, Jack Shaheen has written an interesting book called Real Bad Arabs, which was turned into a documentary in 2006 with the same title. And he has analyzed over 1,000 films featuring Arab characters that were made between 1896 and 2000. And in these films he's looked at, he claims that only 12 representations were positive, 53 were neutral, and 935 were negative. But film and TV have come a long way. It is not all doom and gloom. For example, in the more recent years, some TV series have attempted a more nuanced representation of these characters. In Contino, I'm not sure if you're familiar with or not, you have a Middle Eastern protagonist, a female protagonist as well, Reina, who becomes an FBI agent in an attempt to fight terrorism, which goes against a lot of their stereotypes. But at the same time, the plot is soured by the fact that her twin sister is revealed to be a supporter of a terrorist group she's been fighting against. Or in the Amazons, Jack Ryan, first season represents a narrative plot very similar to what is known today as the ISIS. But for the first time, Muslim Arab actors are employed, and the series offers a double perspective. So from Jack Ryan's perspective and from the terrorists' perspective. And there are a few of the episodes that about 40% of the episode is actually in Arabic. So that's a lot of progress there. But at the same time, it's a story about an ISIS type group. Or in BBC's Bodyguard, there has been an attempt to change the stereotype of an oppressive Muslim woman by, unfortunately, giving her agency makes her the ultimate stereotype of the suicide bomber terrorist. So I don't know, what is the gain here? Yes, there is some progress there for not showing an oppressed Muslim woman what we think, or a lot of other films are shown. But on the other hand, when we're just taking her and making him equal to all the other stereotypes that male characters have been embodied in all these other films and TV series. The changes and positive representation in film are further seen in the past few years with films like The Black Panther and Disney trying to regain its popularity or perhaps respect, releasing corrected live action versions of their problematic animations with films like Aladdin and more recently Mulan. Please don't take me wrong. Both of these films are wonderful achievements for both actors from minority backgrounds and also for the industry itself. But I think if we are ready, it can actually go much further. if you think about it, sure, it's wonderful that Aladdin has now a full cast that actually come from kind of minority backgrounds that could fit within the greater Middle East, if you like. And of course, the ending is changed in a way, I'm sorry if I'm spoiling it for you, that is a lot more feminist, and you know, the princess has a lot more agency, but the film is still kind of riddled with a lot of stereotypes that is not much changed from the 94 cartoon of Aladdin. At the same time, Black Panther, it's fantastic to see that now we have a Black superhero in the Marvel series of superheroes. But at the same time, he is a superhero hailing from Africa, so he has to be Black. But if we would have seen one of the characters, one of the other superheroes coming hailing from America to be Black, then that would have been perhaps a more diversity kind of tick, if you like. Or achievement, and it is something that has been it has been received and been achieved, for example, in the animated Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. So it is something that it is I think filmmakers and the industry is quite aware of, and they are moving towards. What I'm trying to get here is that there are two ways films can become more inclusive from this perspective. One is successful diversification of the stories, focusing on minority groups or communities, like this brilliant film by Gurinder Chadha, the light-hearted but very effective film, The Blind by the Light. I hope that you do already know the wonderful filmmaker that brought us Bend It Like Beckham. Or films could choose to be inclusive by employing characters of color or from minority backgrounds, that the positive side of blind casting for characters that could be played by anyone. So to not fall in the trap of typecasting, in my opinion, Danny Boyle's film Yesterday is successful because the fact that the Himesh Patel's character comes from a South Asian background has very minimal impact on the story. What is important is that he's a young, striving film musician, and he could have been anybody with a love for Beatles. So this is something that we are already seeing happening, that this kind of blind casting, if you like, for certain films, which then this brings me to The Sound of Metal. That is why I think Sound of Metal is extra successful, for not only employing a Muslim actor, but also by not making him a Muslim character. His name is Ruben, and the moment in the film that we think we might learn that he comes from a kind of immigrant background or immigrant parents, we don't. There is a moment that the father of his girlfriend asks him, and that's the moment that I think, when I watched the film, I froze. It's like, oh, this is the moment they're gonna introduce the immigrant background. But they didn't. They represented him as an average American with a mom that works for the military. And I think that's actually a very positive. So not typecasting, not justifying the fact that he's a person of color by making him a further classification or a minority. And I think that's very good. And on top of that, another thing that this film achieves, I think, and is very successful, is by casting a person of color to represent a heavy metal musician with a female lead singer, breaking the stereotype about heavy metal music that can be seen to normalize masculinity and whiteness and perpetuate sexism and racism. So that, at least, that's another thing that is very kind of compelling about this film, and how it's gone against a lot of odds, breaking a lot of stereotypes. And of course, I didn't even get to say anything about representation of disability in the film. And I just want to leave you with this, that in the light of positive changes noted briefly here, Stuart Hall, looking at Britain and the concept of Englishness in his seminal essay from 1987 called New Ethnicities, identified a significant new phase in representation of Britain's migrant communities, which can still be, we can still learn from. And I want to share this quote from with you, that we are all ethnically located and our ethnic identities are crucial to our subjective sense of who we are. But this is also a recognition that it is not an ethnicity which is doomed to survive, as Englishness was, only by marginalizing, dispossessing, displacing, and forgetting other ethnicities. This precisely is the politics of ethnicity, predicated on difference and diversity, something that we're all striving to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope I
That was
made
really
it
good.
the 10 minutes.
I don't think so. I wasn't looking at the time. But yeah, I really did enjoy that, especially I think the point you did say that I mentioned earlier about the fact that, you know, he is this young Muslim man, but that's not the only thing that is his identity. He's more than that. He's, you know, a musician. He's, you know, this young guy who's just trying to like pursue his dreams. And that's sort of a universal truth that people can relate to. And I think it's often underestimated how like little race does have to do with things. You can do that blind casting, but it's also about not using that as an excuse to not cast people of color as well. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword in that sense, I suppose. Yes. Jav, would you like to go?
Absolutely. And thanks so much for that, Mariam, as well. It was delightful to just listen to and to reflect on some of those experiences that I had as a young lad, thinking about when am I going to see people like myself, but not in a very stereotypical way. So evening, everyone. And again, thank you so much, Keela, for inviting me to talk this evening. As I said, my name is Jaff. I am the chair of the Institute for Youth Work. I'll get into that a little bit later. And I'm also the Young People's Programs Manager at Lancashire BME Network. And I'm going to take a slightly different yet such a complementary approach to what Mariam's talked about, which is all about storytelling. So my 10-12 minutes is going to be about telling you about stories that I'm so passionate about. And the story that I'm most passionate about, selfishly, is my own, because actually that's the story that I can tell the best. And as it says in this slide here, as the wonderful Robert McKee said, actually, great statistics get you so far, PowerPoints get you so far. But ultimately, what film does, what media does, what we do every single day as human beings is tell stories. And it's through those storytelling processes do we activate more regions of the brain, and do we then go on to inspire actions. And Riz Ahmed, just being in that film alone, has inspired, I can imagine, dozens upon dozens of young men, if not more, to get into the world of drama, theatre, filmmaking, and much more. And I'm also going to start with the why. And a lot of you will be conscious of or will be aware of Simon Sinek's work. And he talks about starting with the why. And often when it comes to anything really, when it comes to any worldly matter, we often talk about how can we do something or what can we do, but we very rarely think about why are we doing it? Why is Riz Ahmed hailed as someone so significant within the Muslim community and the Pakistani community of which I belong to? Why is it that his films are seen as so progressive? Why is it that we need to focus on this? And I want to share with you my why and why I'm so passionate about this. And my why starts here on what is without a doubt the most horrific, the most saddest, the most abysmal day in our country's history, when 4 men thought that there was nothing else to do, nothing else to live for, to hope for, and felt as though the best way that they could serve their religion, my religion, was to go to London and blow up 4 very different parts of the London infrastructure and the London transport system. And one of those people was this young man. And surprisingly, I don't know about you folks, but he looks very similar to Riz Ahmed in some of the pictures that whenever you see Riz Ahmed. It is in fact Shazad Tanweer. And Shazad Tanweer was one of the 7/7 bombers. And Shazad Tanweer at the time of 7/7 was a mere 21, 22 years of age. And as you can see, there's someone who, and if you read Shazad's background, someone who was really interested in being part of his local community, in being engaged in arts and cultural activity, in being someone that you would talk about being quintessentially British. So what then drove this young man to commit such an atrocity? And it's that I got really interested in. And it was that started getting me thinking about my story. So where do I fit into all of this? And why have I ended up on a different trajectory? Because actually, when I read about Shazad Tanweer, our upbringing was very, very similar. And so my story starts on the day that I was born. And don't worry, I'm not going to regale you with 33 years of my life. I simply do not have the time nor the energy to do that at 7 o'clock in an evening. But I am an Aries baby. I was born on the 26th of March. And I have no doubt that the 3 characteristics that are listed here are the 3 characteristics that have brought me to where I am today, that have hopefully brought you to where you are today, and that have ultimately led me and others to do the work that they do. And I was a baby of the 80s, and growing up in the 80s and in the 90s and the early 2000s, being a Muslim was incredibly interesting. Because as Miriam said, everywhere I looked, I was Muslim by name, I was Muslim by faith, everything that I did was Muslim. But progressively, in particular, as I got into the early 2000s, it almost felt as though this was an incredibly negative and bad label to have. And everywhere I looked, in film, in media, everywhere, it was almost as though Muslims were typecast to be the bad guys. And that really got to me, because I thought that really can't be right. And so my faith was incredibly important to me as I grew up as a young man, as was my hometown. And I would say always that this is the best town ever. And it's not too far from where you find Falkirk, depending on where you are in Lancaster. This is Blackburn. And Blackburn, yeah, it's got its issues, as has been documented in Panorama. I think we were the most divided place in Britain, according to the BBC. But actually, Blackburn has got a tremendous amount to offer. And it's through Blackburn that I've been able to explore my heritage. It's through being in a place like Blackburn that I've been able to think about who I am. And like many of us, I think growing up in the early 90s, into the 2000s, I experienced a significant amount of trauma. And that trauma then led me to dismissing really and disheveling my heritage, my dual heritage. And from about the age of about 12, I became British. That's all I was. I wasn't Pakistani. I'd call myself a Muslim, but definitely not Pakistani. For me, it was this that made me who I was. And that went through my formative teenage years. The strapping lad on the back row, second from the right, is yours truly. Yes, a different world completely. But actually, it was the Britishness, in inverted commas, that allowed me to do some incredible stuff, like be part of my local youth group, that provided me with the confidence to do what I wanted to do more and more of. And that was drama and theatre. That was my passion. My passion was acting. And so I decided to do what any normal person who had a passion does, which was to follow that. And I thought, well, how can I follow that? And I decided that I would do an A-level in drama and theatre. And that was until my mum turned around and she said, how dare you? No son of mine will ever do drama and theatre. And so I was in this rocky position, folks, because I was like, wow, I really want to do this. And so at the age of 16, I had to barter with my mother to allow me to do an A-level in drama and theatre studies. And what I told her that I would do is do a degree in English language. Now, you cannot make this up, folks. And the reason for telling you this is because this sort of mentality, this sort of a system, a structure, unfortunately still prevails today. So yes, Riz Ahmed is great, but ultimately Riz Ahmed is one person. And for me, the challenge that I always have when doing talks like this is how do we as communities understand and support some of those marginalized communities so that they can become as free as they want. And it was at that time that I first come across this film. A million miles away from the film that we're discussing this evening. But that just reinforced for me what I'd believed all along, that actually Muslims were always going to be the bad guys. And interestingly, I then got my first big break in theatre. And I thought, yes, this is my first big break. And guess what, folks? I was typecast, as Miriam was just saying, as the oppressive, conservative, downright disgusting father who was forcing his daughter to get married. And it was at this point, folks, it was at this point that the light bulb finally went on. Because I don't know about you guys, but if you've ever had to do something that is so against your values and beliefs, it seriously triggers something in you. And as I was reading this script, which was all about me forcing my daughter to get married, I went, wow, this is some powerful, powerful stuff. And how can I be a force for good to ensure that some of this stuff doesn't happen? And so what I did was went and set up my own charity. And what I like to do is just show you a 2-minute video clip of some of the amazing stuff that our young people did. And hopefully some of these young people are going to become the next Riz Ahmeds. Hopefully some of these young people are going to end up developing a career in theatre and beyond that. So I'd really love for you to just watch this. I've realized I haven't shared the sound. So what I'm just going to quickly do is do that now. And hopefully that'll give you an insight, and then I'll bring this presentation to a close shortly thereafter.
What if we run away? What if we left today? What if we said goodbye to safe and sound? What if we're hard to find? What if we lost our minds? What if we let them fall behind and they're never found? And when the lights start flashing like a photo booth and the stars exploding, we'll be fireproof. My youth is yours, tripping on skies, sipping waterfalls. My youth is yours, run away now and forever. My youth is yours, the truth so loud you can't ignore. My youth is yours. What if we start to drive? What if we close our eyes? Speeding through red lights into paradise. Cause we've no time for getting old. What a body, timeless souls. Cross your fingers, here we go. And when the lights start flashing like a photo booth and the stars exploding, we'll be fireproof. My youth is yours, tripping on skies, sipping waterfalls. My youth is yours, run away now and forever. My youth is yours, the truth so loud you can't ignore. My youth is yours.
So Slinks allowed me to really support young people, as I said, to become the next Riz Ahmeds, to think about those aspirations, and in particular, those young men and women who came from marginalized communities and who often felt as though drama, theatre, creative arts, film, media, and all of these other wonderful sectors that we're also passionate about were within reaching distance from them. And the other thing that it allowed us to do was to travel the world, and young people got to meet a plethora of other young people who interestingly had similar lives to them, and who interestingly had similar passions, and who interestingly wanted to do the same when it came to being involved in arts and cultural activity. And by traveling the world, what I started to get a sense of, folks, was this part of my heritage. And I became, in the last few years of my life in particular, have become more and more prouder to be a Pakistani and of Pakistani heritage. And I've been really proud to share that from the rooftops and to demonstrate that actually being Pakistani brings so many wonderful qualities to bear when it comes to the work that we're doing. Because actually Pakistan is full of rich history and heritage when it comes to arts and cultural activity. And so when I think about where I'm now, I am so proud to lead, to be the first person of a Northern background, of a Pakistani background, of a Muslim background, to lead the Institute for Youth Work, a national body for youth workers, bringing youth workers together and being and amplifying that voice of youth workers. But I also do a tremendous amount of other stuff. So as I said at the start, I work for Lancashire BME Network as our young people's programs manager, making sure that young people are consistently and constantly exposed to these opportunities, and then also act as a trustee for these two wonderful, wonderful organizations who do as much as they can to really diversify the offer that they've got for young people. And in the last few years, I've also taken a very interesting turn, and I was talking to Miriam earlier about my educational route, and in particular, my passion for academia. And my passion for academia has taken a step further when I started to engage in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, which really solidified for me what it means to be a human, what it means to be the most effective person that I can be. And in turn, and in closing, that's brought me full circle to being someone who is incredibly, incredibly proud to be Pakistani and to be British. Something that I know absolutely without a shadow of a doubt, Riz Ahmed also is. Now, before I finish, you're probably sat there and going, that's all good and well, Jaff. What's next for you then? Well, this, I want to share with you, and I don't share this often, folks, my aspiration in life. And Keela, I'm looking more to you because you're at the Duke's Theatre in Lancaster, and I'm hoping you can make this dream happen. I would love to be in a panto. Absolutely love it. It would be a dream come true for me. And not only would I love to be in a panto, I've got a very specific role that I want to play in a panto. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, can I thank you very much for listening? And I'm happy to take any questions.
Wow. I think you'd be amazing in a panto, actually. I think you'd absolutely smash that. So maybe we should look into that. But no, you raised some very good points there. Thank you for sharing that story with us. I know everyone else will agree. Really nice to hear sort of where you've come from and how you've gotten to this point. I think it's especially important to think about the idea that it is very much sort of ingrained into people as they grow up, sort of this mindset of how other people perceive you and your identity, because of it's, for a lot of people, they don't really think about it, but if you're constantly being reminded that, yeah, you're the bad guy, as you said, you know, that can do a lot for your self-confidence. And so even if you have access to those opportunities, you might not feel like you can pursue them. And so I think it is very important, and it's really good the work you're doing to be able to help these kids sort of achieve those dreams and those passions. So thank you for that as well. I'd also like to sort of talk a little bit about part that we didn't touch on, which is the idea of how he's deaf in the movie. I don't have a PowerPoint for it, I'm afraid, but I will just speak to it. So I think a lot of media in general, I suppose, doesn't really talk much about disability. It's often seen as a bit taboo, a bit of a awkward subject potentially, because people don't want to sort of offend, but they also don't want to acknowledge it, I suppose, as something that is very real and a lot of people do experience on a day-to-day basis, and they don't have that recognition in mainstream media. And so I think it is very important that we have stories like this that sort of show that, and like stories about mental health, like physical health, are often sort of seen as niche, but they should be a bit more just part of the norm, I think. I know I've done a few blog posts for the Dukes page, and I try to include captions for the images, just because not everyone is like, people might be blind and they might use like screen readers to hear the posts. And I think it's just being aware of those sort of things in your daily communication and being able to make those adaptations for people, and just sort of being a bit more conscious, I think, in the everyday life. And movies like this can help you be more aware of that, I think. Do either of you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I can just echo what you were saying, that, and also we see it kind of looking at representation of kind of certain disabilities in films. It's very minimal, but we see it in recent years. Again, looking at mainstream, another film that actually cast a female that's born deaf, and using her ability with sign language with, like, you know, a quiet place. I think it's a good example to mention as well, because breaking that kind of mold, and it's coming into the mainstream kind of horror genre, and that's something that is quite fascinating, and hopefully we'll see more of that, because the same way when we think about minorities, people living with certain disabilities have been pushed to feel kind of marginalized in the society as well. So I think there's a lot to be shared between people who live with certain kind of disadvantages, perhaps physically, would be very similar to people with more diverse backgrounds that might feel that they don't belong. And I think films, I'm in education, it is something that it's our job to kind of make sure that this is not the same way. At least I can say within the university setup, students who have perhaps certain identified disabilities, we make our what is possible to help them, that they won't be disadvantaged in their studies if they need extra time or any sort of other assistance. And this goes as far as making even our PowerPoints accessible. And I love the fact that you mentioned, Kila, about posting description of images. And I think perhaps a couple of years ago when this was introduced, a lot of us thought, oh, this is a burden, but it's not a burden. Like, it is something that becomes part of your natural everyday. And if it even helps one person to kind of understand the message you're trying to kind of bring across, an extra person to reach it, that's what exactly the world should be trying to achieve and do. So yeah, thank you for that example. And that's something that I think all of us should do. And I'll make sure that any post I put on our departmental social media, that it's accessible. It's important.
It's interesting when you look at films that have that intersectionality. You know, you think about people who perhaps, for example, are Muslim, and then they've also got a disability, and the films are far few and far between, and yet the ones that are there are so impactful. And the one example that I'd give you, and if you haven't seen it, folks, please Netflix it this weekend, is a Bollywood movie called My Name is Khan. And My Name is Khan is about a Muslim living in America who is autistic. And ultimately the plot is that his son, 8-year-old son, gets murdered because he's a Muslim, and it's after 9/11. And Khan goes on a road trip up and down America, various states he visits to basically say, you know, even though my name is Khan, I'm not a terrorist. And you see him in some incredible places, and in some incredibly emotional places. And yet, to this day, if you ask anyone about My Name is Khan, especially within the Pakistani community, I would feel, or the Indian community, everyone has got rave reviews about it. And yet it's not seen as one of those movies either in the limelight, or it's not seen as one of those movies that there were regular occurrences of that. And that for me is a real shame, that actually what we need to do now, what the film industry needs to do now, is become much more progressive in terms of this intersectionality, because ultimately it exists. And now we've got a label for it. What we can do is start to talk about it more and more openly. And the more that people can see that actually they are complex individuals made up of various different identities, and the more that is accurately represented in films, the more that I think will go a long, long way in making sure that people feel respected, valued, and feel a part of society in a really meaningful way.
Thank you. So whilst you guys were speaking, I did ask the chat to put some questions in. I have one that I don't think you guys can see, but I will read it out to you, which is, well, I'm not sure. I'll just aim it to both of you. It says, how do you think we can tackle the problem of Muslim misrepresentation on screen via programming on a local independent cinema level? Do either of you have any ideas spark to mind? Mariam, you are the film expert.
One of the ways, usually, like a lot of bad things, let's look at something negative first. How do something becomes normalized in a society? It's because we've seen a lot of it. It's that whole idea of why post 9/11, this whole terrorist label for kind of Muslim registered characters, like people who would think they might come from a Muslim background. It's because we've seen a lot of it, left and right and center, whether it's news from reality to fiction, in that sense, is represented that way. So that's the way to attack it, that misrepresentation, by doing the same thing, bringing good representation or nuanced representation. So my kind of academic brain has issues with positive and negative in a kind of a black and white manner, because we are, you know, all colors of the rainbow in a sense, and there is no right or wrong. So more nuanced representations of the characters would help us. So if there's more examples, and if there is more films that are representing that, you know, kind of making it and bring it to the general public, that would be great. Like, for example, like the wonderful film that Jeff just mentioned, like making sure that is reached for, you know, larger audiences and not just communities that identify with the characters, might help. There's a few questions I can see here.
There are quite a few questions.
Yeah.
Jeff, have you got anything you'd like to say on that one?
Yeah, I think for me, just that local question is really interesting. And for me, it's about connecting into as many communities as we can. We're all guilty of it, folks. We're all guilty of targeting the same. I'm guilty of it, right? We all target often the same communities. And the way we get to what Miriam's talking about is by broadening our horizons, by broadening our expertise. And just as a quick plug here, if I can help in doing that through the Lancashire BME network, then please let us know, because we've got a membership of 120 groups and organizations who ultimately will be doing some of that stuff. Whoever asked the question, they ultimately will be working with people on the ground who are developing local films. And as Miriam said, the more that those films are then shown, the more that confidence grows. The more that confidence grows, the more films are made. It's almost cyclical. And I think we can then do it at perhaps at a very Lancashire level, which could then span far greater.
Great, I love that answer. Okay, so our next question is, maybe we'll go Jeff to you first this time. How powerful do you think films are in broadening people's understanding of underrepresented communities and lifestyles?
Massive is probably the one word that I'd use. It's just huge. And I think that's all underrepresented communities. And it's a shame how many films have got such a negative stance. And whether that's you're a Muslim, whether that's you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community, whether that's you're a disabled person, it is such a shame, because films are incredibly powerful. And for me, I'm going to leave it at that.
Amazing. Miriam?
I think throughout this whole session, we've been talking about it. Yes, like that's the, of course, because on a regular level, like on a daily basis, it is one of the kind of, we all watch things for entertainment, for passing time. So it is the easiest way to reach people. Like we write books, like, you know, there's different kind of outputs that people and academics or researchers or people like Jeff that are working on the front line of different communities are doing it. But I think it's actually the entertainment. It's a perfect way to kind of inject the correct kind of viewpoints and reach a wider audience. So I'm a firm believer that that's like the best way to go as well.
Yeah, that's very true.
If I can just add, is that, you know, with the advent of stuff like Netflix and the expansion of stuff like Netflix and Amazon Prime and all of these wonderful streaming sites, well, films have become part of our everyday life for many, many people. And in actual fact, for some people have overtaken, you know, stuff that they might have watched on terrestrial TV back in the day. And so they're even more powerful now. And that's why there's even more of an impetus on directors, producers, filmmakers to make sure that the representation is as accurate as it can be.
Definitely is, especially about that access is so much easier these days, which can be both good and bad if that representation isn't right, if it's not hitting the mark. So I think that's why it's especially important that we do push for that good and positive like representation rather than it being all negative. So those are very good points. Our next question is, do you think disabled roles should only be played by disabled actors, as they believe that Riz Ahmed isn't hard of hearing? Miriam?
That's a very good question, and it is a discussion to be had, and there's a lot of dialogues about this, which goes again similar to that whole idea of kind of blind casting as well. It is harder perhaps, because if these are certain things that we need certain infrastructural changes. So if, for example, at school level, our theater and drama and art is more inclusive to allow young people with visible disabilities gain experience, then they would be able to then come out and act and be actors and take those parts. And so I'm not saying that no or yes, I'm saying that it's not as easy. If we say yes, ultimately I would want it to be that, the same way that I think I praise A Quiet Place because a deaf person is acting as a deaf character. But that is a very unique case, and some wonderful, very brave director first attempted to work with her, and then a mainstream director kind of carried on. So yeah, if we are interested in that, we should make sure that our young children are exposed to that and are being given the courage that they can to grow up and become actors, that they can then represent different characters.
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, it is that sort of idea of those opportunities and having the courage and feeling like you're allowed to pursue those roles, because yeah, I'm pretty sure that a lot of kids who sort of have disabilities probably are convinced that they'll never be able to do that because it's just not possible. Whereas, you know, it could be just if someone takes a chance and gives them that opportunity.
Exactly. So the first step, I think, is, sorry to just add to that, is to have enough characters represented with their type of disability, so they see themselves first on screen, to then think, oh, I could have acted as that person. They didn't need to kind of fake my disability.
Yeah, it's like a sort of like a snowball effect, I suppose. Yeah. Anything to add to that one, Jeff? Even?
It really is what I think, adding on to what Miriam said. Do I think? Absolutely. Just as I think that a Muslim person should play a Muslim character, just as I believe a gay person should play a gay character. You know, I think none of these should be done by people who don't have those lived experiences. It's as simple as that. And that's how you can bring your everything to it. But as Miriam said, unfortunately, you know, and I tell you the story of my mum. And honestly, folks, if I was to regale you with that story in its content, you would be shocked at the fact that I was having to kind of barter off the fact that mum wanted me to do an English degree. I was nowhere even near thinking of a degree for a drama and theatre A level. And so this is about changing hearts and minds. And do I hope that one day disabled roles are played by disabled actors and Muslim roles are played by Muslim actors? Great, that would be the dream. But it's, as Miriam said, it's about how do we start that, and we've all got a part to play in that. We've all got a part to play in ensuring that we make this an equitable and fair society for everyone.
I think we're going to have to be a little bit more speedy because we're running out of time. So just very quick. Oh, it's moved down. What character in a TV show or film did you first feel represented by, or what character do you feel most represented by now? To either of you, if you've got an example.
So my first time coming across this sort of entertainment, as a young lad, I turned on the TV and I saw WWE, so the wrestling. And I remember seeing Hulk Hogan in all of his glory and all of his red and yellow. And for me, even though he was a white man in America, wrestling, which is not a real support, people tell me, I have to disagree to some extent. It was almost like that color that just drew me in, that said to me, actually, this is what I want to do. I want to provide that joy and that entertainment in people's life. I want to be able to be the reason why people smile. So I don't think it's necessarily a TV film or a show that I feel represented by, because I think, again, it goes back to that intersectionality thing. But if there was something that inspired me in terms of something that I saw on TV, it would definitely be Hulk Hogan and watching the wrestling back when I was 4 or 5.
Amazing.
And if I can add to that, this is something that sometimes in my teaching, I try to kind of bring it about, is that I grew up in Iran. And I was 19 when I left the country in 2001, ironically, and live and go and study in Canada. But when growing up, you know, because I was in a dominantly Muslim country, it wasn't something that I was looking for my representation in international films, because there was enough films produced in Iran that would represent me. What I was growing up in the 80s and wanting to be quite feminist. So what I think I found strong female characters anywhere, that they were the ones that I wanted to identify with, and I wanted to be them. So for me it had nothing to do with their ethnicity or background in that sense. It was what they were doing. So I wanted like strong female characters. Yeah.
I also want that right now. So okay, this next one's a little long, so apologies if I trip over my words. It says, often non-European countries within films have a specific color grading over them, making them look gray or brown. Then in contrast, in films like Aladdin, the color grading and the mise-en-scène is so bright and colorful to the extent that it becomes stereotypical and plays towards Orientalist norms. Why do you think there's such a stark contrast between these depictions? Mariam.
Thank you, Damla. That's a very good observation, and it's exactly what I was mentioning about specifically Aladdin, that although now actors are people who could come from whatever we think Middle East is, or the stories of 1001 Nights coming from, and you have that kind of switch at the end for her to kind of be the king, although, like, you know, their law doesn't allow it. But the image, it's still very stereotypical. It still has that kind of Orientalist, as you call it, look. And why is that? To be honest, I don't know. It's like we should go ask Guy Ritchie. But one assumption I have is that we still live with certain prejudgments and preconceptions, and you almost, as a mainstream filmmaker, you're scared of showing something starkly different, because it would be starkly different. And that is the reason that they put in, like, you know, they think they've changed enough to make it realistic, but then they put kind of the, you know, the stardust of fakeness and Orientalist to kind of make it still reachable. It sounds very bad, but I think that's the reason they're doing it, to kind of still cling on to certain elements that we think Middle East looks like.
And I just want to add, I just want to add to that. I don't know if anyone's watched the live remake of The Lion King, but honestly, I was so upset by it. I was so upset by it, because it's what you said there, Mariam. It's almost like it got the whole kind of facade about lions being able to talk was stripped away. So I was watching these real life lions, knowing full well they can't talk. They weren't moving their mouths at all, as was in the cartoon when they were moving their mouths. And yet voices were coming out. And you're so right there. So I think with Aladdin, what they've done is they've made it just different enough to take into account Black Lives Matter and everything else that's happened over the last 2 or 3 years, but also really enough for people to go, you know what, that was pants, wasn't it? Or without people saying that, sorry, without people going, that was pants, that wasn't worth paying money for. So I think that's one thing. And I think the second thing for me is that I actually don't think people realize, you know, some of these directors, I don't think they actually believe that there's such a stark contrast in these depictions. I think when they're making them, and this is a cynic in me, I think when they're making them, they're going, this is exactly how it's meant to be. And let's be honest, we do buy into some of this anyway, because how many of us went to go watch The Lion King or Mulan or Aladdin or any other remake for that matter? So the more we continue to buy into this sort of way of filmmaking, I think not a lot's going to change. You'll see small tweaks, like Mariam said there, but then overall, you still see that kind of that depiction, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Definitely makes sense. All right, we're going to quickly do this last question and then we're going to wrap up, because I'm aware that it's very close to 8 o'clock. Okay, I am going to assume this was aimed at what Jaf said before, which is, are actors supposed to represent themselves and their lived experiences, or could it be more a question of opportunities, like being known and being called to castings, etc.?
So really good question, and I agree with you. That's not necessarily what an actor's meant to do, is to live through their own lived experiences. I gave you the example of me having to play an older Muslim gent who was conservative, etc., etc. Absolutely loved that role. I think what I'm trying to say is, for us to become equitable across the system, is we need to make sure that those roles at least have that level of representation. So, you know, it's interesting when I read credits and I see that there's a non-Muslim playing a Muslim, and go, well, how does that happen? You know, and I'm not saying that Muslim has to be ultra Muslim or liberal Muslim. What I'm saying is, just be nice to have the fact And I'm hoping that the disabled community and the LGBTQ plus community would agree the same.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective as someone who studies cinema as well, kind of looking at it is that I do understand that some of the greatest masterpieces of cinema, it's the fact that we see certain actor has acted and represented a diverse roles. So from that perspective, I think I personally don't want necessarily, if it's a Muslim character, I don't think personally I care enough whether the actor behind it is Muslim or not, but I want them to kind of not pass as Muslim. That's the issue, is that trying to kind of pass as by just going into the first kind of groups of actors that you have and then stay with it, not opening the door to a diverse group. So from that perspective, I think the films that I think, as I mentioned in my kind of brief presentation as well, that are successful are those that they have diverse, ethnically diverse, by looks diverse characters in roles that anyone can play them and anyone could be. And then they chose not to go with the first famous white actor. That is, I think, where I hope the industry goes, and that would be a successful element, because I think what Jaff is saying, that the passionate storytellers, as you're interested in storytelling, to bring this to a close as well, I think there's enough people with similar backgrounds to you that might want to tell their stories. And then if the industry opens up, then it will invite enough of those behind the scene to tell their stories. And then that automatically will help the representation in front of the screen as well. And we'll have a much better world that way.
What a lovely thing to end on. But thank you very much to our lovely guests. Thank you for everyone that's come and joined. Thank you for everyone who's asked questions and stayed engaged. I hope you've all learned something. If you're interested in watching Sound of Metal, if you haven't already, it is on Amazon Prime, so very nice and accessible. I'm going to drop this form back in the chat. It's only like 2 or 3 minutes, so please fill it out if you have the chance. But yes, thank you. I will plug that we do have another widescreen session on the 1st of July. We'll be talking with the director and actress, Mina Anwar. And yeah, thank you is really all I have left to say. So have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you again to our guests. Very interesting. I feel like I've learned a lot. I hope everyone else has.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for everyone who attended. It's lovely to recognize some names here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Have a lovely night, everyone. Good night.